Let's set up a system for spawning in our spaceships, and then we'll make the spaceships that actually spawn in and move left and right, shoot at the player, etc. All right, so the first thing, now that we have a lot of this stuff set up, instead of having to click to start to every time we test, what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to take our canvas and just turn it off for now while we test out our spaceship. While we test out our little UFO and UFO spawner. I'm going to go ahead and right click and create an empty. We'll put our FSM on here. We'll just call this UFO, and we're gonna put FSMs on here, and then while we're testing, and then when everything's looking good, we'll just copy them and paste them over here on our game object. Okay, so this little game object, this little UFO game object right now is just temporary for us to work without having to load in everything else in our game while we test it. All right, so what I want to do is I'm going to right click, add component. So we have our FSM in here to actually spawn this in. We'll call this our UFO spawner. Okay, and in here, let's start with the logic that decides which side of the screen the UFO spawns on. So the idea is that it'll either spawn on the left or the right side of the screen. So if it spawns on the left, it'll just move from left to right. If it spawns on the right, it'll move from right to left. And when it spawns on either of those sides, we could just set up a couple of game objects, like one right here and one right here, and then it'll always just pick one or the other. Or we can just give it coordinates, and we can also just make it spawn higher or lower. So it's either the top left, the top right, or sort of in the middle or somewhere in between there. So what we could do is, if I head over to my actions, type in random float. So we could type in, there's a difference between random float and select random float. Select random float is going to let us put in the actual floats that get used instead of a range of a value. So in this one, I'll say that the amount of floats we need is 2. Okay, so that gives us 2 values. And the values that we want to use, I want to represent the screen. Remember, we had the normalized screen where I was showing you that it's like between 0 and 1, 0 being over here and 1 being up here and here for each of those axes. I want to be able to spawn just outside of the screen right here, right? So if this is 0, you might look at this as like negative 0.1. And over here for 1, if it's just outside, this might be just 1.1, okay? Which means that the two values we want are going to be negative 0.1 or 1.1. Okay, and we can store the float as a new variable. We'll just call this x, okay, because that's our x-axis. And then we'll use the actual random float, which is a range between 0 and 1, to decide our y. And that way it's just between the bottom of the screen and the top of the screen. Now this logic is for normalized values, right? We're doing it between, we're looking at the screen in terms of 0 and 1, but we need to make the world space coordinates like we did before. So again, we could use that action, screen to world point. Okay, I'm going to drag and drop this in here, and we'll put in our x and y for the screen coordinates. Those are normalized values, and they'll spit out our spawn position. And then with all those, we could put in a create object action. Okay, so this is where we'll actually spawn in our UFO. We don't have a UFO yet, so for the time being, let's just say that we spawn in a medium asteroid. Okay, this is just for the test. We'll actually make the UFO prefab in a second, but let's just make sure that this is spawning on either the left or the right screen, and let's just make sure that this little spawning logic is correct, right? So then the position that it's spawning at is our spawn position. And then just for testing as well, I'm also going to put in a wait action down here. So every 1.5 seconds, it'll repeat itself, so we could just see it happening again and again and again. Okay. Now I'm going to look at our scene view, or actually, let's make sure this is playing unfocused, and let's look at our scene view. Okay, and look at that. They're always spawning at either the left or the right side of the screen, but at different heights, at different y-axis values. Getting a lot here on the left. Oh, there's one on the right. Okay, the right. See, sometimes they're low, sometimes they're higher. That one was higher, that one popped up. Okay, this is working out. Let's get rid of that. And we'll get rid of the wait in here as well. We'll call this state spawn UFO. Now what we want to do is actually create our UFO, and then we'll give logic to our UFO to decide which direction it should be flying in. Because if it's on the left, we don't want it to keep flying left. We want it to fly to the right, or else we'll just never see it. And then the same thing goes with the opposite side. So I'm going to go over to my project and go to sprites. And in here, I have my little UFO small and large. We're going to start with the small one. I'm going to drag and drop that in there. And let's focus in on it. Go to my prefabs, and I'll drag and drop my UFO small in here. All right, then I'll delete it from the scene. We don't need it in there. But I will now open up the prefab, and on this, we're going to add an FSM. To begin with, we need to find out which side of the screen our UFO is on so we could decide which direction it should be flying in. The way we're going to do that is by using a get position action, get position 2D. I'm going to pop this in, and for our X position, we'll say X position. And then we can use a float sign test to decide which direction it should be going in. So we're going to check our X value that we just got. And if it's positive, we will move left. And if it's negative, we will move right. Okay, let's add these transitions. We'll just call this spawned in. Move left, we'll go to this state. Move right, we'll go to this state. Now, this is what helps us decide which direction we're going in, but we can also use this X position information to actually move the thing. So we're going to save this X position in a separate value. So we're going to go set float value and put this in here right after we get the position. And the float value that we're going to set it in is start position. And we're going to set that start position with this X value. So we're basically just duplicating this X position. We're kind of getting this value twice. So it exists here in this variable, the X position, and in this variable, the start position. And then we're going to use a float abs, which is just absolute, right? It's short for absolute. And we're going to put that right after the set float value. Okay, we're going to tell this start position to become its absolute value, which is just to say that if it's a negative value, then we're just turning it into a positive. And we'll do some stuff with that in a little bit, but let's just get to these other states where we're actually moving. These two states are going to set the direction that we're moving in, and then we'll actually go to a third state over here where we actually are moving. Okay, so this is going to be move left, and this one will be move right. Okay, and so what we're going to do is set vector 3 value. Okay, we're going to be setting our movement vector. Okay, this is what we're going to use to actually move our UFO around. And we're going to set it so that if it's moving left, then that means that we're moving -1 on the x-axis. And then you can just leave these other values alone because it's just going to move left and right. Okay, so I can copy and paste that in here, except this time it's going to be +1, just 1, right? If we're moving right, it's moving on the positive value of the x-axis. Another little bonus thing in here, though, we can also do a vector multiply. Okay, and we'll say that the movement vector is going to be multiplied by a variable that we can make called speed. Okay, and I'm going to copy and paste this and put it in the other state as well. All right, so all that does is it takes this value, this movement, which is, you know, starting with either -1 or 1. Either way, it's like either way, it's like 1, right? It's like a single unit of movement. This multiply vector will multiply it by a speed value that we can set to say how fast this UFO moves. And that way, we can have a small UFO that moves a little faster, and then the big UFO can move a little slower. All right, so with this speed, right-click on it, edit variable. It just takes us over here to the variables tab. I'm going to make it an input variable. That way, we could change this later on. That way we can make this into a template later, and the speed variable will be available to us for both the small and big UFO. Okay, by default, I'm just going to say it moves around at 3 units. Now, both of these, once they're done, they will just finish and go here to the moving state. Now, in here, we could put in our screen wrap, except the one thing that we want to change here, usually we just leave everything as is, but this time we're actually gonna uncheck this left and right. That way it doesn't wrap around, and we can actually just have it move back and forth, kind of like ping-ponging back and forth instead of doing the wrap where it just magically appears on the other side. Okay, and then we're going to use a translate action to do the actual moving. So we're going to be moving our spaceship with the vector we made, right? Our movement vector. We can keep this to world space, and it'll be per second every frame. So that'll at least keep it moving. And then we could just do a random wait action here at the end, which will say between 1 and, say, 3 seconds. 1 and 5 seconds, it'll randomly change direction. Okay, so this finished event, we can make a new event, change direction. Add that transition, send off down here to this state where we change direction. We could add a little movement on the y-axis. Select random float again. Okay, so let's just make this, 2, and we'll just do a 0.4 and a negative 0.4. So it's either going up or down. That way our UFO does a little zigzag direction. Okay, we'll store that float in a new variable called move y. We'll throw a float multiply in here too, by the way, for the speed. Okay, so we'll put that in right after, change our move y by multiplying it by our speed. And then we could do a set vector 3 xyz, and this one allows us to set each of these values independently, the xy values independently. So we could say that our movement vector, we could change our y-axis of it to this move y. Okay, and once that's finished, we could just send back up here. Let's see how this works out. Let's drop our little UFO into the scene. We'll just have this spawner here. So this this create object, now we could drag and drop it our UFO small. And before I forget, actually, let's put in a wait here so it doesn't make a million of them and crash Unity. Let's have it wait every 2 seconds. Now let's see how this plays. Where are these guys? Oop. Okay, here we go. Yeah, so they're spawning it on this side, and they should spawn. Yep, they're spawning on that side too. Looks good. They're bobbing up and down. They got a little random movement to them. We could take this logic over here that we made, the spawned in, where we get the position and do the float absolute. Okay, so I'm going to select these by, so I'm going to select this get position, and holding control, I'm going to select the float absolute, and I'm going to copy those by hitting Control C, or you can come over here, Control C, and up here, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put these all under a header. So look, I can collapse these actions, right? So all the logic for it moving is in here, but I can create a new header by right-clicking and saying new header, and we'll just call this like our movement, right? And then I can create a new header, put it down here for our out of bounds logic. And so now down here, I can come in and grab our get position 2D and our float absolute and copy these actions and paste these actions in here. So now they could be under this section. I can collapse movement, so now we could just see this stuff. It just keeps things a little bit more organized, a little bit more tidy. So what we want to do this time is, instead of making the flow absolute for start position, we're just going to do it straight with this X position, okay? That's like the starting X position. That's its current X position. And we could make this running every frame, and this as well. So it's constantly getting the absolute of its X position. And then we can use a float compare and compare our X position, right, what it's currently at, with its start position. This start position, remember, we saved this back here, so this will always be what it was in the first moment that this spawned in. And if X position is greater than start position, we can say that you are off screen. Okay, and then we can come over here, right click, add global transition, off screen. And then honestly, we just put in like a destroy self action. So it just gets rid of itself, okay? Destroy self. What we also need to put in here is, of course, right click, add global transition, custom events, hit by bullet, all right? Because we'll shoot these as well. And the thing is, we haven't set up the actual collider for this yet. So let's do that. Let's add in put in an edge collider 2D. All right, and we will, let's just say, put a point right here, and then, actually let's put them down here, okay, and then we could go like this, This looks like a fair shape. Something like that. Okay. And since we could send this hit by bullet event now, that means we could put in a destroy self, so the UFO will get destroyed. Now the thing is, should also get points for this, right? So let's do the same thing that we did before. We could set event int data, right, for our points. Oops, for our points, and we'll say that this is a variable that we could say is whatever, points. Okay. Let's make this an input as well, so when we turn this into a template, the big UFO will be able to have different points from the little UFO. And then we'll do a send event. Okay, so it'll be set event int data, then we'll send the event, it'll be a broadcast all, and it'll be the global event add points. Sets the points, tells the thing to add the points, and then destroys itself. So destroyed. And now let's take this this whole FSM we made and right click in here, save template, and we'll call this UFO. Use the save template in this FSM, yes, okay. And you can see over here, points and speed. Speed, we'll keep it at 3, but points, let's say that it adds, for the little UFO, right, we're using the small one, 2,000 points. And that way, what we could do is change this so that the big one gives you something like 4,000, and the speed is maybe a little slower, like setting it to 2 instead of 3. But before we go and make our big UFO, let's finish one little thing left here, which is the actual shooting. So the UFOs should be able to shoot at the player as well. I'm going to add in another FSM. Okay, we'll call this one, if I put it up here, we'll just call this one move, right? And this one is called shoot. And I'm going to hit edit on this shoot FSM. And this is just going to be 2 states. In this one, it's going to be a wait, right? So we'll put in a wait state right here. This is just the time in between shots. We'll make this a new variable. We can call this one like shoot delay. Okay, right click, edit variable, make it an input. That way we could change, this one is like, let's say 1.5 seconds, 1.5, right? So it waits 1.5 seconds before, put a finish transition here, before it goes to the other state where it shoots. Okay, so in the shoot state, here what we want to do is put in a find game object. Now, we don't need to put a name. You could put a name, but I think what we could do is instead use a tag. And so tags are a way of identifying game objects in Unity. Things can only be tagged as one thing. And you can see it up here in the inspector. You have a tag and a layer, right? So every game object has a tag and a layer. Everything by default comes as untagged, but you can put in new things here. You can create your own tags. So you can see that the ones that by default Unity comes with respawn, finish, editor, main camera, player, game controller, whatever it is. But we can add our own. We'll add one, and so we can basically tag our spaceship as the player. We're not going to do that just yet, but that's what this is going to be using. It's going to find a game object. We can hit this little equals button so it just doesn't look for anything, any name in particular, but it'll look for something tagged as player, and then it'll store that as the player. Okay, so that finds the game object with the tag player. Now, if you had multiple game objects in your scene that were tagged player, this wouldn't work as effectively. It would really know which one to get, right? So when you're using this, you're basically saying, I'm looking for something and expecting to find a specific thing with this tag. And since we know that there's only going to be one player spaceship in this, we could use this, right? So it's tagged as player, stores it as a player, as a variable called player game object. And now we could use this to aim at the player. So what we need to do is make a thing that aims at it. We need to basically make a little cannon. We could use this look at 2D game object right here, this action, look at 2D game object. Now what this does is it'll rotate a 2D game object to always be looking at a thing, right? Remember, we use this for our movement on the player spaceship. But our UFO is already moving left and right, and it has its little y-axis up and down. If the UFO itself is turning and looking at things, it's gonna move. It's gonna really change how our little UFO pilots itself, and it's just not really gonna work right. So instead of actually making our UFO turn to look at it, we can change the game object that's turning, and instead we'll actually right-click on our UFO and say create empty, and this empty we can call our gun pivot. Okay, so it's just an empty game object. If I look at it here, I select it, okay, it's right here in the center of our UFO because we created it like as a child of this when we right clicked on it. So it's right here in the center of this. And what we want to do is rotate this thing, this little empty thing, as a way of aiming at the player. See how our spaceship stays still, but our little gun pivot can move around. And then what we could do is right click on gun pivot and create another empty and call this the actual bullet spawn. Right, so this one we could sort of put back a little bit so it's not touching the UFO. And that way, when we move the gun pivot, see if I rotate this up like this right now, look where our gun spawn is. It's up here, right? It's kind of like a little cannon that got lifted. And that's just the same thing as I move it around this way. It's going to be up here now, watch. See, it's like over here. Okay, so we can make that rotate and that'll face the player. So we could drag and drop that in, our little gun pivot. And the target object is going to be the player that we just got. And then in here, we can create object. We'll create our bullet. Okay, so we're spawning in a bullet. Its spawn point is the bullet spawn. So drag and drop that in there. We'll store that instance of it because with this create object, it's cloning this prefab. So the clone that this creates, we'll store that in a variable called bullet. Okay. And now that we have a reference to it, we could tell the bullet itself to look at the player. So we can put in another look at 2D game object right after that. And we're saying that our bullet should also look at the player. And then we're going to put in a add relative force 2D, right, to give force to our bullet, right? And the force mode is going to be impulse, and it's only on the x-axis. We could put in something like 10, and that'll be good for our bullet to fly at the player. Okay, and once all that's done, just add a little finish transition, send back up here where it waits 1.5 seconds to do it again. All right, so let's go back into the scene. And I am just going to activate these parts right now just so we could spawn the player in. And this should basically still work. We should be able to get an idea of how our... Okay, so I'm coming over here to our player spaceship. And on this player spaceship prefab. And if I just select the game object up here, and I could tag it as player. Okay, and that way our UFO has something to aim at. So now with all that set up, I could play this. And when I start the game, look at that. It's already shooting at us. See, they're already with impeccable aim. We could shoot them and racking up points for it. Okay. Now, the one thing that I'm noticing here is that once they shoot, they never shoot again. Look at that. That guy just shot. I'll fly next to him as long as I can. Okay, look, he's never shooting me. Just floating along. And the reason for that is if I pause this and I select one of these UFOs, look at this. Look at how right now this look at 2D game object is running every frame. So even when I unpause this, it's stuck here. This when it's green, that means this action is running. It's still doing its job, right? And of course that makes sense because every frame is checked. It just says, hey, keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it. And since it doesn't send any events or anything, it's just stuck there. And for that reason, it was stuck in that state. So if we go to the UFO prefab and look at the shoot state, if I uncheck this every frame and this every frame, right? Both of those are running every frame. Make sure nothing in here is running every frame. Otherwise, this finish transition will never be able to fire off. Okay, this finish transition, remember, it only can do its job. It's a little sort of built-in behind-the-scenes programming. It's like a very special type of transition. It'll only do its thing when all of the actions in its state are finished. Okay, so now that those every frame options are unselected, this should work just fine. Okay, now instead of making the large version of the UFO, I want to challenge you to make your own. Okay, if it's a very simple setup, you can either make it from scratch or you can even duplicate the prefab and try to like make some changes here. But everything that you need to set that up, we've learned. And you should be able to do yourself. So that's a good little thing to try to do on your own. A little bit of practice. I'm sure you'll get it because everything you need is right here. I can just right click and copy this UFO spawner component, come over to our game object, and I'm going to paste it in here. So I'm going to right click up here and just say paste, component as new, right? And there it is here at the bottom. And I could just take this old one and delete it. So over here on this one though, I'm gonna hit edit, and the thing that I do want to change is that over here where it waits, the time, I'm just gonna change to a variable, new variable, and we'll call this UFO spawn delay. And I'm gonna right click and hit edit variable, and we'll make it an input. We'll start with every 10 seconds, but I also want to pose a challenge to you that you figure out some way so that in your game loop, the delay can shrink so that more UFOs actually get spawned in a shorter amount of time. And to even maybe try spawning a different number of UFOs per spawn delay. Otherwise, this is pretty much set up and ready to go.